The ambassador to China is defending the Trump administration's decision to track Chinese diplomatic officials in the U.S. According to Derry Branstad, China has been restricting the work of U.S. diplomats in China for decades.
Branstad says U.S. diplomats in China are not able to speak at universities or open events. The Trump administration argues China is taking advantage of the open U.S. system by sending diplomats in order to influence U.S. citizens. Newt Gingrich discusses the growing Chinese presence around the world in his new book, Trump versus China, Facing America's Biggest Threat.
The former Speaker of the House joins us now, and we're so happy to have you here. Thank you for coming by.
Again, Mr. Speaker.
So let's talk about what we just brought up here about tracking Chinese diplomats here in the U.S. Should we be doing that? Is that really?
Yes.
Is this a little un-American? No?
No, I think when you're dealing with a dictatorship, you have to adopt rules that fit the dictatorship. And I think that it's not un-American. We did this with the Nazis. We did this with the Soviets. We're now beginning to realize that, the Chinese are not a Rotary Club. They're a communist dictatorship, a totalitarian system based on Leninist principles. Mm-hmm. And they cheat every day, all day. And unless we get used to understanding, that's what we're dealing with. It's not a normal country.
You said earlier this morning on CBS This Morning that we're in real danger of our grandchildren learning Chinese. Why is that a problem for you if our children, our grandchildren?
I'm using that as a symbol, which you just saw with the National Basketball Association, that they'll end up obeying Chinese rules, living within a Chinese framework, doing what Beijing wants them to do, learning Beijing's version of history. And so it's a totality of whether or not the Chinese are going to dominate and define the culture of the human race for the future.
Does the President of the United States see it the way you do? I understand that he sees it economically, but does he see it as a battle of values in the way that you write in your book? Because when he talks about Xi Jinping, when he talks about the leadership there, even going so far as to congratulate that country on the birth of the Communist Party in China. I thought that was remarkable for a U.S. president to do something like that.
Yeah, I thought it was a mistake. I think that it's like celebrating the anniversary of the Soviet Revolution in Russia.
Right.
I think the president's about halfway there. He has been more aggressive and more direct about China economically than any president in American history. They've now begun to take steps like the one we just talked about, where they're squeezing down on their rights. They have taken some steps to start sanctioning companies that are producing technology for dictatorships, including companies that are working to repress the Uyghurs in Western China. So you see more active stuff, but we're still, I think, probably 5 to 7 years away from fully understanding what we're going to have to do. We went through this with the Soviets. It took us from the spring of 1946 to the summer of 1950 to finally realize that we were in a real Cold War and that we were going to have no choice except to contain the Soviet Empire. We're going to have part of the reason I wrote the book is I think Trump versus China is really designed to say to the American people, this is a new, different version of reality. We're going to have to come to grips with it, and we're going to have to recognize how profound a threat it is to us.
But wouldn't what's happening in Hong Kong be a perfect opportunity for this president, much in the same way that those of you in leadership in the 1990s and before that in the 80s and the 70s and going back to Kennedy, to say, look, this is an opportunity for the United States to help to embolden young people who are searching and clamoring for democracy. This is the perfect stage to do that, and he's been unwilling to embrace it.
I agree with you. I think this is a place where the more we can do, and I know that we have people who are pushing bills in the Congress. For example, Marco Rubio has had a real leadership role in this. Ted Cruz has taken a leading role. I think there is a desire to send signals here, one, that we're on the side of freedom, and two, that there will be real consequences for the dictatorship if it violently imposes in Hong Kong. And I think we should take a more aggressive position. And I think if you watch week by week, we're getting tougher about this. And I think Trump has a natural tendency, goes all the way back to being a real estate guy in New York. He has a tendency to say he wants to like you. He wants to get along with you. And I think that it's the Xi Jinping, the gap between the conversation they have and the reality over here is beginning to sink in, that there's a huge gap between the real Chinese position and whatever schmoozing goes on at the top.
So what role do you think business plays then? We saw, the drama that unfolded with the NBA trying to do this dance between their fans and China.
I think something like 17% of their revenue is from China.
Should it be like that?
Well, I think even if it is like that, I think we should take the position that the U.S. government should intervene and say to the Chinese, we're going to cost you 3 times as much money as whatever you do to the NBA. So just understand, we are going to protect them. You can't expect a company to take on an entire country. But you can say to that company, you get to come into the shelter of the U.S. government, and we will take on that country on your behalf. And we're going to have to develop capability of doing that.
So part of what your book talks about, it talks a lot about technology and how China has sort of gone to the forefront in so many ways, whether it's a 5G or surveillance. And you've said that we misunderstood China's push towards a more open economy, feeling that a more open economy would then lead to openness in other areas. And that's not what the Communist Party was all about.
Right. Look, I count me in this group. When Deng Xiaoping, who was then the leader, went on what's called the Southern Tour and made a series of speeches about the need to open up the economy, it was great and it was very exciting. And it certainly led to an enormous economic explosion in China. What I didn't realize, I think almost none of us did, was Deng Xiaoping was a founder of the Chinese Communist Party in the early 1920s. Spent a year in Moscow at Lenin University learning how to run a Leninist totalitarian system. What he was saying was, look, we've got to become prosperous so they will put up with the dictatorship, not so we can change the dictatorship. And that's why when you get to Tiananmen Square in 1989, Deng Xiaoping is one of the people who's toughest about saying, kill him. And because he'd watched the Soviets collapse, he'd watched Gorbachev fail, and he's saying, if we're soft, they're going to run over us. And so I confess up front, I was one of the people who thought maybe this is the beginning of opening up. It's very clear now Xi Jinping has more power than anybody since Mao Zedong. He is consolidating power. He is clearly a totalitarian. And the things they're doing are actually pretty sobering.
Can we talk about Huawei and 5G?
Sure.
They're
absolutely.
sort of like leading the forefront. They're at the forefront of 5G development, and there are municipalities here that use Huawei's products. Why are you concerned about that? And
well, okay, if the Chinese define the next cycle of the internet, and it's going to be a much bigger internet because it's going to include the Internet of Things. You communicate, your refrigerator communicating, et cetera. If they define that, and they produce, for example, the surveillance tools so the dictators can stay in power because the Chinese help them, we end up in a world in which we basically are crowded out at the very top of the information systems. And I would say this has been the greatest Chinese strategic success so far and is an enormous failure of the American system. Our bureaucracies have failed, our companies have failed, and we have allowed the Chinese to take a huge lead in this area. And I think it's very formidable and very sobering. And the result is, whether it's in Great Britain or it's in Germany or a whole host of countries, the governments are saying to us, look, my local telecommunications company tells me they have to use Huawei.
Right. And you were a product of the American education system. After Sputnik was launched, the United States said, all of a sudden, we are lagging behind the Soviets in math and technology. We've got to catch up, and we ultimately did. We put a man on the moon in 1969. Why are we lagging behind? Is it partly due to education?
Oh, it's huge. Look, this is one of the untouchable conversations in American life. Okay, the National Education Association stands for mediocrity, and it stands for brainwashing. And if you read their position on all sorts of issues, they're very left-wing, and they're failing. So you go to Baltimore. There are 6 schools in Baltimore that had not a single student pass the exam last year in math or in reading. Not a single student.
But one of the things that, people will counter that and say, one of the things we don't do very well in this country is really invest in our education system, provide the funding that's needed.
Baltimore's the 3rd or 4th most expensive school system in the country.
But it's relative, right, Mr. Speaker? As you know, it's relative to the way other countries spend on their education and the way the United States does.
Look, there are some private schools in New York, in Harlem, that 99% of the students graduate and go to college. But they're disciplined. I mean, if you look at the mound of bureaucracy and the mound of regulations that now surround this, it's so bad that you actually have a group of academics who are now arguing that mathematics is a Western supremacy idea, and we don't really need to learn numbers because that's subordinate. I mean, these are serious people. There's a school board in Washington State wrestling with whether or not they can, in fact, abolish having to learn numbers. No.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I'm not familiar with that at all, so I can't comment on that. But so let's turn to 2020. Let's talk about what's going on up in Washington, D.C. Mick Mulvaney, if you were advising the President of the United States, if you were the Chief of Staff, would you have gone before a Washington press corps that hadn't had a briefing from that press briefing room in many, many months and essentially confirm what had already been reported, what had been released not only through the transcript of the president's call with Volodymyr Zelensky on July 25th, but also in the whistleblower complaint that, in fact, there was a quid pro quo? Would you have gone and would you have told the press to get over it?
If I had had the ability to do it, there wouldn't be a White House press corps in the White House.
You would not.
Why is that?
Because they're all the enemies of the president. I mean, why would you call on people who get up every morning saying, I hate Donald Trump, I wonder how I can make his life miserable?
This is the opportunity for the president to speak to the people, right? Through the media.
The president can speak to the people anytime. He doesn't need to go through a bunch of reporters who are then going to be distorted by their editors.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think we have to push back on the idea that a press corps is an enemy of the president. That language, which you have also been criticized in the past for bringing some of the vitriol that we now see in Washington. When you got to the Hill, you started to use the language, much of the same language that the president of the United States uses. And people all of a sudden said, wait, this is not a civil war. We are all Americans. We all love this country. We all believe in it. We believe in the Bill of Rights. We believe in the freedom of the press. And the press is there to hold public officials.
We have a bunch of Democrats in Congress who are violating the Bill of Rights by the very way they're holding this impeachment.
The American people, more than half of the American people, want to see this impeachment inquiry continue. Just because it's not being run the way you would like to see it run doesn't mean that Nancy Pelosi does not have the right, much in the same way as you did when you ran an impeachment inquiry.
First of all, we voted. Second, we used Peter Rodino's rules.
She's not saying she's not going to vote, Mr. Speaker.
No, we voted to start it.
We
allowed the White House to have a lawyer in the room. I mean, Secretary Pompeo yesterday said it perfectly when he was on a show, and he said, look, I have no idea what my own employees are saying because they're going into this room. I have no lawyer there. I have no knowledge. They share no information, and all I get are the occasional leaks by the Democrats.
You call it a kangaroo court, which is, again, language that you don't hear in this country.
It's true. Look, it's not my fault that they're corrupt.
Let me ask you about advising the president, to piggyback on that, because you've had a lot of stuff happen over the weekend. The president announced, what Mick Mulvaney was trying to announce was that the G7 was going to be held at the president's own resort in Miami. Would you have advised him to do that?
No.
In the midst of all of this?
No. And I frankly don't know why he did it. I'm glad that he dropped it. It was a really bad idea.
Why would he do that? You know the president. Why would he do that? Mick Mulvaney goes on the Sunday talk shows and says at the end of the day, he's still in the hospitality business. If you're an American citizen, you say, well, no, you should be in the representing America business.
And you've divested, and you've divested from the hospitality business.
Yes, according to...
If you watch the way he operates, I suspect he did it because he figured the worst that'll happen is he'll get 3 days of bad press and then he'll drop it. The best would happen is people say, oh, that's cool, and then he'd do it. I mean,
so what if you're Marco Rubio and you've gone on the record saying you got no problem with it, and the president comes back and says, you know what, not going to do it after all? I mean, there is a limit, I guess, to Republican support for this president when he does things that forces them to go back to their districts.
But there should be a limit. Look, presidents aren't kings. I mean, you know, when a president does something wrong, on Syria, he didn't brief the Congress. They didn't know what he was doing. He got very strong criticism from the Republicans. And that's the way our constitutional system ought to work.
So, Mr. Speaker, let me ask you one more thing. So we've seen sort of back-to-back semi-reversals, right, over the weekend, whether it's the G7 thing, whether it's quid pro quo versus not quid, and also Syria. This idea that we have to get out of these endless wars. We are bringing our troops home. And now we find out that, in fact, we're not bringing the troops home. They're going to Iraq, and some may actually stay in Syria.
And there's an increase in Saudi Arabia.
It certainly seems like the foreign policy is kind of being, you're building the bicycle as they're riding it.
It's not a bad way to put it.
But that doesn't. I mean,
that's not a good way,
yeah.
though.
Is that how it's supposed to be done?
But look, part of what's happened is this is a president who campaigned in 2015 and 2016 and said, these things aren't productive. We're getting young people killed and deeply maimed for no good reason. We're spending trillions of dollars. He was very clear about this. He brought in a team, and people I know personally I like very much. The team decided their job was to convince him he was wrong. They spent 2 years, and he kept saying to him, either give me a strategy for victory or give me a strategy for getting out, but don't tell me I'm going to rope-a-dope for another 8 years. And the truth is they couldn't give him a strategy for victory.
If the outcome of this is, as military analysts, former retired commanders and admirals say, the resurgence of ISIS, will it have been a good move?
No, but I don't know that we have any reason to believe that's what will happen. I mean, you've got the Russians.
You've been in this game long enough to know that there's a vacuum, and the Russians will fill that vacuum.
There's not much of a vacuum with the Turkish army there. You've got the Russians there. You've got the Syrians there. There's a lot of things going on. And as the president said, our capacity to bomb allows us to say the minute there's a training camp, wipe it out. You don't have to put people on the ground risking casualties everywhere. And I would argue, by the way, if the news media was really doing its job, we'd be spending far more time on the civil war in Mexico, which is a much bigger problem for us than Syria.
We have reported that here at CBS News. It's something that we've covered extensively. So, yes.
And we need an American strategy to help Mexico win that war.
The question is, can the president focus on an issue like that when he's dealing with fire at home with the impeachment inquiry? He's dealing with the fallout from his decisions in Syria. He's still out there saying that he's building this wall. And you're talking about this civil war in Mexico, which is a really significant issue. In addition to China, Hong Kong, the Uyghurs, which is in your book. There's a lot going on for the president of the United States. Should he stay off Twitter?
Welcome to the presidency. I mean, that is...
You say, though, you said on CBS this morning that, that we knew who Donald Trump was when the American people elected him. But is this the way to...
I think they had a pretty good notion who he was. And I think, frankly, part of the reason that the people stayed with him was that they wanted somebody who would be disruptive. They wanted somebody to kick over the table.
What is your take on the state of the presidency now, though? Because we're watching the polls tick. Like Vlad mentioned, more and more people are in favor of impeachment and removal. Right. His disapproval ratings continue to sort of go up. I mean, where do you think things stand?
If you could give him a grade. And he was at 45. In the last series of polls, he's at 43. He was at 45.
Okay, so
he's
around the same place.
He's about where Obama was, actually, at this point in the Obama first term.
So when you hear
my guess is he's going to get reelected, and everybody on the left is going to go crazy.
So when you hear Lindsey Graham say, as he did this weekend, that he's open to removing the president if it in fact is brought to light that the evidence is there that there was a quid pro quo, is that should that be worrisome for the president? Somebody, a staunch defender like Lindsey Graham.
First of all, senators should not rush to prejudgment either way, and I think you'd be a pretty bad member of what is, after all, a court. Because the Senate becomes a court.
Right.
If you ran in and said either I'm guaranteeing you I'm going to vote to impeach him or to convict, or you ran in and said I guarantee I won't vote to convict. I think the evidence does matter, but I think it's pretty hard to argue that this is going to rise to the level of removing him from office.
All right.
Always great to have you here, Mr. Speaker. We covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, we did.
It's fun to be with you two. You managed to go through a lot of stuff.
Yeah,
we try.
Well, there's a lot of stuff in the book that we didn't get to.
But there's a lot of stuff that we want to
Right.
ask you about because of your long history in Washington, D.C.
No, but as long as you put the book up, I feel
there
good.
it is.
The book right here.
There you go.
Newt Gingrich's new book, Trump versus China, Facing America's Biggest Threat, is available on all platforms starting tomorrow.